under emergency management, like there was lost democracy, public health wasn't at the forefront of decisions. That is absolutely, it was also the case with the pandemic response. There was a failure of good governance. The second bit that is also very similar is the science denial. So basic common sense science was dismissed and denied in Flint, like water treatment science and life science, and the voice of scientists and experts were also dismissed and denied. And pandemic, same thing. We have had the manipulation of science-based agencies, doctors and whistleblowers and other scientists under attack, which has also kind of lost the credibility of our science-based agencies like the CDC. So very similar, but also still not unique to these conditions, because even before Flint, we had widespread science denial with, the anti-vaccine movement and the lack of action in terms of climate change. So, and then the third big, very parallel lesson between what happened in Flint and the pandemic is the role of public health disinvestment. So part of the reason Flint happened is because, our pipes are old. They haven't, we've learned them, which we should. We haven't, we think our roads are bad in Michigan. Like what's underground is like probably even worse. We also haven't invested in the public health infrastructure of health departments, like at the county level and the state level. We spend a lot of money on health care, which is after people get sick, but we don't spend a lot of money in what keeps people healthy. And that's the same with the pandemic right now. So we, of course, we can't muster, rapid testing and, vaccination programs, because our health department capacity, our public health capacity, has been really purposefully, disseminated or, decimated for years. And as a nation, there's no amount of ventilators or intensive care units or, medications that's going to prevent the lack of investment in public health. So that's another third big lesson, and that was similar. And I think the last one is the role of inequities. So Flint never would have happened in a richer or a wider community. And that's been, brought up in many reports, including the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. And the pandemic also does not fall equally on certain populations. Our vulnerable, our predominantly minority communities are disproportionately burdened by the pandemic. So lots and lots of similar lessons. And that makes me so happy, because for so long we have been trying to share the lessons of Flint, Flint was also not the first time those lessons happened, and trying to, for example, have leadership that values public health and include scientists at the table and work to kind of robustly build the capacity of our public health, and work to eliminate inequities. So, after the nation is now kind of going through these same lessons, and that gives me hope, because in Flint, we took a crisis and we tried to turn it into an opportunity. And I'm hopeful that the nation sees the kind of this generation defining crisis that we're in right now, and also turns it into an opportunity to address all these things.
Awesome. So we had one question, asking just generally about the Flint water crisis. So maybe could you explain for our students sort of the process of your research that you presented in the press conference that really led to the whole discussion on lead in water?
Yeah, and I see like a question like, can you go into the Flint crisis? And so let me just like briefly share like what happened, because it's been a long time ago now, and there's a lot of crazy things that have happened in the world. So it's understandable. So let's see if we can make this as interactive as possible. So in the chat, besides all the people taking attendance, what was Flint famous for? You guys tell me, what was Flint famous for before the water crisis? Like 100 years ago, you guys, cars, Alexis got it first, so cars. So Flint was famous for being the birthplace of cars, the auto industry. And then what else is Flint famous for that happened shortly after cars were being made? And we just actually a week ago celebrated the 84-year anniversary of this event. So, shortly after cars were being made, General Motors was making a lot on strike. Oh my God, William, you win. So in the 1930s, the auto workers in Flint did something really brave and disobedient. And they occupied the car plants in Flint, and they sat down and they stopped production of cars because they're like, hey, the company's making a lot of money, but we're making a lot of money. And we don't have things like living wages and benefits and pensions and healthcare and housing and education. So they went on strike, demanding their share of prosperity. And they won. The strikers won, which was an amazing story. And it's in my book for a tiny bit, and I read like 4 books about just the Flint sit down strike. It's an amazing piece of Michigan history and really our country's history. So because of that kind of that work of those strikers and the deal that was established, Flint is not only the birthplace of cars, but it's also the birthplace of the middle class in America, the whole middle class in America, because of what those workers did and the deal that emerged from that. And Flint became this place of prosperity, where immigrants all over the world came to Flint for great jobs, where African Americans fleeing the oppression of Jim Crow South came up to Flint as part of the Great Migration North for better opportunity, not always equality, but better opportunity and prosperity. And then you got to know what happened afterwards. And this is a history that we often close our eyes to. There's a lot, if you read the book, there's a lot of history, and people are like, well, there's so much history, because history is important. So take more history classes. Because I was always taught, and it's something I teach my learners, we step over history every single day. And if we want to understand kind of where we are and why we have these problems, we have to start by looking back. And that's the only way that we can end up going forward. And the history that followed in Flint is similar to so many other communities, post-industrial communities. Jobs were lost due to automation, robots, cheaper jobs overseas, plants closed, and that led to high rates of unemployment and poverty and violence and crumbling schools and population loss. And the list goes on and on of all kind of the disparities. And all those things impact health of children. And really how they turn out, which that's one of the reasons I was drawn to Flint as a pediatrician, to address some of these social determinants of health. A kid in Flint actually lives like 20 years less than a kid in another part of our county. 20 years based on like your zip code. That's not okay. That's not okay in the richest country in the history of the world. So lots of crises in the city, and the city was near bankrupt. And because we were near bankrupt, the state took over the city. We were under some crazy law called emergency management, which I could spend an hour talking about that, but that was also pushed through against the will of the people. The state of Michigan voters voted it down. Our legislature tweaked it and pushed it through. And that meant that overnight Flint lost democracy. Like, well, isn't that what America's all about? Democracy, having elected officials and representation and holding people accountable. So that was gone, and the emergency manager was in charge. And at one point, half of Michigan's population was under emergency, half of Michigan's African-American population was under emergency management compared to 2% of the white population. So there was even like national media on our story before we were a water story, but when we were a democracy story, because people are like, this doesn't make sense. This is not America. This is unjust. So the emergency managers decided that the water that we had been getting from the Great Lakes was now too expensive for this predominantly poor, minority, and near bankrupt city. So in April of 2014, our water source was changed from the Great Lakes. And I'm doing my Michigan plug, right, guys? We are the mitten state because we are surrounded by water. The largest source of fresh water in the world is around Michigan. And here's Flint, kind of in the middle of the largest source of fresh water in the world. We used to get our water from Lake Huron, but in April of 2014, that was switched to the Flint River. And the water wasn't treated properly, and it was missing this ingredient that was really important called corrosion control. And that made the water super, super corrosive. That corrosive water took out the lead that was in our plumbing. and put it in the water, and people drank it. They drank it for a long time, for about a year and a half. And even though there was lots of problems and concerns, everybody in charge, all the officials in charge, said things were okay. And I love to share the story because my jaw still drops when I share it. But just within a few months of our water switch, General Motors, which was born in Flint and still has plants in Flint, noticed that our drinking water was corroding car parts. Like, can you believe that? Like, I still can't believe it. Our drinking water was corroding car parts, engine parts. And they were allowed to go back to Great Lakes Water. And the people of Flint were literally told to relax, that everything was in compliance, that everything was okay. So my involvement in the story came from hearing about the possibility of lead being in the water. When I heard about the possibility of lead being in the water, my life absolutely changed. Uh, when you are a pediatrician, you understand the science of what lead does. It's a poison, it's a neurotoxin. It impacts the development of children, how they think, how they act. It has life-altering consequences. I also know that lead is a form of environmental racism, a form of environmental injustice. Flint kids, like so many of our nation's children, are disproportionately exposed to poisons like lead. So I quickly did the research to see if there was more lead in the blood of Flint kids. I never should have had to, because we knew lead was in the water. But even those water scientists were being attacked. The moms who held brown jugs of water, they were being dismissed and denied. The pastors, the journalists, the water experts, so many folks were worried about this water, and their concerns were minimized. And I knew if I was going to make a dent in the story and protect my kids, my Flint kids are my kids, that I would have to, prove with science that they were in harm's way. Shouldn't have had to. The crisis never should have happened, but definitely should have ended when we knew there was lead in water. So that's kind of how I got involved, and then publicly shared that science at a press conference, which is not something that doctors or academics usually do. We don't usually share our research at press conferences. But there wasn't another day to spare because our kids were in harm's way. And it took a while, but finally we got our water source changed back.
Erin, you're muted.
When I read the book, I was just in complete awe of how you were able to trace the blood levels in such a short amount of time. Well, you said every day mattered, but I mean, you and your colleague Jenny did a study that would take most people years, and the turnaround to have it published, it was 3 months, I think. I mean, it was just amazing. Could you talk about the actual study and the process that you used? A lot of the students on the call are also in a class called Science and Humanities, where they look at using the scientific method to research. And the way you explain it in your book, it's just so crystal clear, and the attention to detail, but also the quickness that you were able to work out is just amazing.
Yeah, I think it's because neither Jenny nor I slept. Like I literally lived on coffee. I still drink way too much coffee, but it consumed us. Knowing that our kids were drinking this water, that it was, filling baby bottles and sippy cups. Like we couldn't sleep knowing that. So our research, even though it was conducted in such a short period of time, really was a lot of person hours, because like if you consider like 24 hours a day that we were working on this. And I felt so bad because she had a little baby and she was nursing, and I would always be texting her. I'm like, can we rerun the stats this way? I'm so sorry to bother you. I know you're trying to feed your baby or do this. But it was really driven by this grounding in that our work is about service, and it's about service to children. So we had a question, right? Science starts with a question. So we had a question like, are more kids exposed to lead than really kind of before the water switch happened? So as pediatricians, we screen children for lead exposure at the ages of 1 and 2 when a kid comes for their checkup. If they are in a high risk group, which are like kids on Medicaid, because that's a proxy for poverty. If they live in an old house, if their parents have certain hobbies or employment that puts them into contact with lead, then kids, as part of their routine well child exams, get a blood lead test at the ages of 1 and 2. It used to be universal, like 20 years ago, when lead levels were a lot higher. The recommendation from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, was that every kid gets a lead screening at the age of 1 and 2. But as lead levels have come down because of policy regulations that have limited the use of lead in paint and gasoline, not every kid gets screened. And when that recommendation happened, a lot of doctors and places, they just didn't screen as much. So the rates of screening have gone down significantly. And the screening age is set at 1 and 2 because it's at those ages when kids are walking and they're crawling and they have a lot of hand to mouth activity. They put everything they find in their mouth. Oh, there's a lead chip, I'm going to put it in my mouth. And the worst is lead chips are actually sweet. So then they keep putting it in their mouth. So the surveillance system for this blood lead screening of lead was devised to pick up the greatest risk from household lead exposure, like paint and dust and soil. Okay. And but that's all we had. And I'm just like one doctor in one clinic in Flint. So I can tell you about like some lead levels of my patients. But I can't tell you how the population is doing. And that's one of the differences between medicine and public health. So we really rely on public health for what we call surveillance. And there's a whole department in most states and also at the federal level that gets every lead level that's done in the state, and they can track and trend and see how things are going and see what's happening at a community level. So when I wanted to find out what was happening in the blood of Flint children, was there a difference from the surveillance data? That's where I went first. I went to our health departments who had this data, for all the kids. It's a law in Michigan. Every blood lead test done in the state has to go to the state surveillance program. And they wouldn't give me the data. I couldn't get that data. So then I'm like, well, I still need to figure this out because I need to know what's happening to my kids in Flint. So it turned out that our hospital, the Hurley Children's Hospital in Flint, we actually process most of the labs for the community. There's no other kind of like children's hospital around. And through necessary approvals, like you have to go through something called the IRB process, the institutional review process, to make sure that your research is being done ethically and protects patients and what have you. We conducted the research from our own labs that were done within our hospital. We looked at lead levels, these screening lead levels before the water switch, and we compared them to lead levels of children after the water switch. So we compared 2 different time periods. And it was really kind of simple research. And we noted that lead levels after the water switch were higher. And then we did some really cool mapping with our friend who's a geographer, and they used really cool things called GIS, Geographic Information Systems. And we noticed that in the areas of the city where the water lead levels were the highest from the water scientists, we also saw the greatest increases in children's blood lead levels. So we were able to correlate blood lead levels with water lead levels based on geography. And then the other striking thing that we noticed is outside, we also had data for like the whole county. Outside of the city limits, there was no change in blood lead levels. So the increase in blood lead levels only happened within the city limits on the water. So that was kind of what the research was all about. It wasn't rocket science. It started with a question. It started with curiosity, and being able to kind of interpret and assess data. And I think for all of you who go into science and live with data and statistics and find yourself staring at Microsoft Excel way too much, I think what enabled us to push forward was also the recognition that these these weren't just numbers like on a spreadsheet. Every single number was a kid. And it was probably like a kid I'd even like seen and cared for like within the last couple of years or so. And it was kind of that recognition that numbers were actually children, that allowed us to kind of persevere and persist, despite kind of the overwhelming obstacles.
I'm going to group a few questions together. We had a few questions on the EPA's response, and was there some, questions about, the federal government? How has that responded, and what policy do you see as successful? I know that there was some funding involved, but what policy could be done to prevent this in the future?
Yeah, those are great questions. The EPA was also culpable here, not as much as the state. The majority of the blame in many investigations today lay at the feet of the state. The EPA did their own investigation. They had an inspector general, and they found that the EPA should have acted about 7 to 9 months sooner. They knew there was lead in the water. They should have been more public about it. They also silenced a whistleblower, an amazing person at the EPA. So there was definitely fault at the EPA. However, the state had something called primacy. So the state was in charge. And that's what most of the investigations to date have also revealed. Flint never should have happened, and there never should be more Flints. And unfortunately, there have been things like Flint since Flint. And there's a lot of policy changes that need to happen to strengthen our drinking water protections. I know too much now about drinking water laws, and they can be stronger. Our science has not really been reflected in policy, but there have been some really great policy changes that have happened, especially in Michigan. So the lead and copper rule is what governs kind of lead in your water. It's part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The lead and copper rule hasn't been updated in about 30 years. Michigan, because of what happened in Flint, has adopted a model lead and copper rule that exceeds federal standards, and it mandates that all of the lead pipes in Michigan have to be replaced in the next 20 years. That's amazing. We're also doing better sampling of water to better pick up lead, and decreasing the action level. And our governor has put significant investment in drinking water infrastructure. In Michigan, we now have an environmental justice advocate at the state level, somebody whose focus is environmental justice. We also have a safe drinking water advocate. And the very first executive order that our governor did when she was in office was a whistleblower protection order. So encouraging state employees to speak up when there's something that may be endangering the health or safety of the residents of our state. And those are just a few examples of how policy is kind of being adopted based on the lessons of Flint. Even the recent declaration that racism is a public health issue, that's also related to Flint. We need more people in all communities to recognize that this is also a crisis that's affecting people's health. At the national level, so the last time that I testified in front of Congress was right before the pandemic. It was like February 2020, and it was about the national lead and copper rule and how EPA needs to strengthen it so we don't have future Flints. That rule was actually revised in January 2021, so last month. That rule was finalized after almost 30 years. But like many things in the last administration, it was a missed opportunity to protect public health and the environment. So the current Biden administration has done something called, they've pulled back the rule. So because it was finalized so close to a term administration change, they can kind of reopen it and address it. So I'm hopeful that it will be strengthened so that there's more transparency, that policies will catch up with science, and that we can especially protect our most vulnerable populations.
Okay, we have a question from Dr. Schultz, who's asking, recently in the news, there was a settlement for exposed Flint citizens. Given your inside view, do you feel these values were determined fairly?
Oh, that's a great question. And that's a tough question. So lots of folks used to ask me about like the lawsuits and who should go in jail and what accountability should look like and how do you quantify justice? And I used to like ignore those questions. Like I'm like, oh, to ask the lawyers, like that's not my job. But I've come to realize that it's actually a critical part of my job as a physician. Because without this concept of justice, restorative justice, and accountability, the wounds of this crisis continue. The wounds of this crisis won't close without having an element of justice, and it remains to this day very raw. For the people who people of Flint. I've also learned that justice is defined differently by different people. You can ask 10 different people in Flint and you'll get 10 different definitions of what justice is and if it's fair or not fair. So some people are happy with, this charges being filed against somebody. Some others are like, no, this person needs to go to jail, or this settlement is never enough for the harm that was caused. So it's very, very difficult for anybody to say if something is fair or not, because it's a very personal determination.
So how has your role as a physician changed since the book, since uncovering the elevated blood levels? Has your practice shifted?
Yeah.
Yourself as a doctor now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's really reaffirmed to me what it means to be a doctor. One of the reasons I went into medicine, and especially pediatrics, is to be an advocate. So that was always kind of part of my job description. I'm a clinician, I'm a researcher, I'm an academic, I'm an educator, and I'm also an advocate. That's always been part of my job. So it's been reaffirming to be able to really use my MD credentials as a megaphone for the kids of Flint and for what they need. I was always an academic. So I was never really your typical pediatrician where patients could come and make appointments with me. I was always a professor. So I was always a medical educator, teaching medical students and residents. And I remain a professor. I remain in that education capacity. So I'm still in clinic. I see patients once a week, but always with learners, with residents and with students. And now that I direct this Pediatric Public Health Initiative, which is this partnership between Michigan State University and Hurley Children's Hospital, which is really more focused in the world of public health. I've also had, I also have learners with me, but they're all kinds of learners. Just like this book covers so many different disciplines, like I also have like law students and engineering students and communication students and all these different kinds of folks that are part of our team, because one of the other big lessons of this story in this book is the value of team, and how important it is to surround yourself with people who are really different than you, because you look at things differently and you can also solve problems in a different way.
We have a couple of questions on both what was the struggle for keeping the Flint story in the media to affect real change, and also addressing racism. What are the steps needed to generate real change? So how did you generate change? And do you have a recipe for generating change?
Those are great questions. So when the Flint story became a national story, an organization came to town called the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, like crazy. So they're an organization that helps raise money after a disaster happens. And they were giving us advice. And they said, you only have 60 days to hold the media's attention. Like people will stop caring about Flint after 60 days. And that's always struck me. I'm like, but we need more resources and we need more time. And this has been going on for so long. But it's completely understandable. I mean, like our nation, especially these last 4 years, there's been like crazy story after crazy story. So obviously, we can't stay on one story. We have to continue learning about all the other things that are happening that are also really important. Oh my God, like what's happening in Texas right now? This is crazy. And we should all be kind of focused on kind of current events and what's going on. So nobody expected media or attention to stay on Flint. But one of the reasons I wrote a book was to put a spotlight back on Flint. And being here with you helps put a spotlight back on Flint, but not to tell you so much about Flint and Flint's story, but to share with you how the story broadly is not an isolated story, and how we mentioned earlier with the pandemic really speaks to so many injustices that are happening all around us, and also the power that we all have to make a difference. To open our eyes, like we said before, and take action even when it's hard. So I think that gets to the second question, which I kind of forgot, but it was about like, how do you create change?
Yeah, and also focusing on the racial justice aspect of the Flint water crisis.
Great. The Flint water crisis, like I said earlier, never would have happened in a richer, wider community. Several reports, including the governor's task force, the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, and others, really pointed to the role of racism and the demographics of the population that perpetuated this crisis. A few statements, one in the book, where an official at the EPA, this came out in released email, said, "Flint's not a city worth going out on a limb for." Like, why not? Like, because you don't live there, your kids don't live there. And when the EPA was finally trying to get the state to treat the water properly, the head of the water department said, "But who's drinking this water anyways?" So it's statements like that that really speak to the indifference, the blindness that so many folks had towards what happened in Flint. And to move forward, there needs to be a reckoning, which is why these efforts at accountability and justice are so important. There needs to be reparations, be it a settlement or be it kind of the resources that come in. And kind of there needs to be investment in the long-term resources to mitigate the impact of this crisis. Also, kind of at a national level, there's all this efforts at being more anti-racist and what can we do to really address systemic inequities. Like lead elimination needs to be on the top of people's lists, especially for cities and states. To this day, way too many children, Black and brown children, are exposed to lead, and we fail them. And there's a long kind of history of racist evil of the lead industry. For example, lead paint was mandated in public housing. They often blamed the victims. They blamed the moms when kids were exposed. So there's a lot that we need to kind of be aware of and address.
All right, I have a question from Dr. Luckhart, and this is from her entire class. In looking at the book, the way the story unfolds, especially early on, what feeling or feelings were you hoping to evoke? It's deep. I like that
Deep.
one.
A lot of feelings. So, when I was writing this book, I had to make a lot of decisions of who my audience is going to be. Like, it could have easily been like a medical sciencey book, but I'm like, no, I want it to be a layperson book. And I also had to decide what perspective I was going to write this book. And I purposefully wanted it to be a first person narrative. Like, I wanted you to be in my shoes and feel what I was feeling. And the feelings that I hope are conveyed, especially in the first part of the book, were a roller coaster of feelings. There was anger and, despair and, but then, hope and, confusion and all over the place. And, just to share that it wasn't like a straight line from the beginning to the end. There was ups and downs. And with that, it was also this kind of emotional roller coaster. When I released my research and I was attacked, I felt I felt physically ill, like I felt tiny, and there was, I began to second guess myself. And, that was a massive also roller coaster of emotions. So, I mean, there wasn't one feeling I was trying to convey. It was just that, they were all over the place.
So sort of piggybacking off of the question about the emotions and writing, there's also a question about why did you decide to include so much of your family in the novel or in the book? What was your thought behind that? Because you end with your grandfather in the story of the birds, which I loved. So what was behind that choice in writing the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love the question. I don't mean this in a bad way, but why do you keep bringing up your family in the book? That's awesome. That is an awesome question. And, when I finally committed to writing a book, which also was a long period of denial that I wasn't going to write a book. I didn't go to medical school to be an author. But then again, I never imagined that I would be at the center of this, emblematic public health and environmental crisis. So when I finally did commit to kind of writing this book, it was only going to be kind of this firsthand account of Dr. Mona in the middle of this crisis, doing this research, uncovering this, blah, blah, blah. And that's what I started to write. That was the book that I started to write. And then as I began to write that book, I quickly realized, like, oh my gosh, I cannot tell you, like, why I did what I did and why I do what I do without telling you who I am and where I came from. Because it is that immigrant perspective that kind of gave me a different way of seeing the world, with almost a heightened antenna for injustice. Growing up, I came to this country when I was 4. I grew up every day grateful to be here. We were fleeing somewhere bad and coming somewhere better. Like, I am an absolute recipient of the American dream. And, I woke up, like I said, every day grateful to be here, but also acutely aware of what people in power can do to vulnerable populations. I included the story when I was like 10 or 11, and I saw pictures of the chemical weapons attack in northern Iraq, where 5,000 people died that day because a leader wanted to get rid of them. And I don't know, maybe my parents shouldn't have showed me that, but like, it was those kinds of experiences that truly shaped me, and into kind of going into service, going into medicine, being a pediatrician, and working in a place like Flint. And when I heard the word lead, when I did something about it. Another one of my favorite stories, family stories in the book, is about my great uncle Nuri, who was amazing. And he, in the 1930s, he left Baghdad to fight in the Spanish Civil War, against the fascists, the Franco regime in the beginning of World War II. He was part of the International Brigade. With all these people from all over the world who were, fighting fascism. And because he had spent some time in the US, he was actually lumped with the Americans, and he was part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. So growing up, I always heard about my great uncle, and like, he had a tattoo, which I also thought was crazy. But, here he was, like, it wasn't about race or religion or country, but it was about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it was. I mean, he risked his life to do the right thing. So you needed to know that's how I was raised, and the value system, that I brought to the story. And then I never would have expected, that when I wrote this book, that we would also be at a place in our nation questioning the role of immigrants. And I wrote a New York Times article called "The Corrosion of the American Dream," because Iraq, where I'm from, was on the first kind of Muslim ban list. And right now there's little kids that look just like me that want to come to this country and can't come to this country anymore. So, immigrants now a bad word, whereas when I came to this country, Lady Liberty's arms were opened a little wider. But obviously that wasn't kind of what I was thinking when I started writing this book, but it also is kind of really important to recognize kind of where we are as a nation and the role of immigrants.
I found
I
that
just had to
chapter
plug my computer. Sorry.
I found that chapter fascinating on the Spanish Civil War. All my in-laws live in Spain, and it was so interesting
Oh,
when I was reading it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just add, so I am like a researcher and kind of OCD. Like writing a book was really hard because I didn't want to stop. I had a word count maximum. I couldn't exceed 75,000 words, but when I turned it in, it was over 90,000 words. But that little section about my great uncle who fought in the Spanish Civil War, like I got his full file from the Spanish Civil War, like during this time. I have multiple books I read about the Spanish Civil War, and he's in there for like a little paragraph. But it really speaks to so many of the rabbit holes that are in this book, which could have been bigger and bigger and probably their own books.
That's what makes it so meaty. There's something for everyone. I mean, even the section of, I think it's a paragraph about Vincent van Gogh and how, he would chew on his paintbrushes. And I thought, I never even equated that to, lead poisoning and Rome and, how you can trace lead back to Rome. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and there's actually, I think it's a two-part question. Obviously, white children, have lead in their blood systems as well, right? But the question, I think, more points to why do Black and brown children have a tendency to have higher blood levels than their white peers?
Sure. So it's for several reasons, which can also be kind of traced to history. So, for example, in Flint, in many of our communities, there was things called racial covenants and blockbusting and redlining that really pushed people into certain neighborhoods, created really segregated communities, especially kind of in the older urban centers. And often the places that they end up living are also rental properties where the landlords don't kind of keep up or maintain those communities. They have often deteriorating conditions in their houses because of, for example, poverty and other kind of disparate kind of life stressors. So there's more like peeling paint, both inside the house, outside of the house, construction that was built a while ago when lead was more allowed. So the sneaky thing with lead, even though we've restricted it in like paint and gasoline and plumbing, it's a heavy metal and it persists. So we might not have a lot of new lead in the environment, but we have a lot of old lead in the environment. So underneath layers of paint in an older home is probably layers that have lead. In soil, especially along roads and highways, and especially in communities that might have had a lot of industrialization, there's also lead in the soil. And also through dust, especially with friction, like opening and closing windows and doors, windowsill areas are also a big exposure for lead. So, poor minority kids usually live in older communities and that aren't maybe kept up as much because of the consequences of poverty. Also, if you are hungry as a child, if you are deficient in certain nutrients like calcium, vitamin C, iron, your body also absorbs more lead. And there's, significant, like I said, issues with poverty and hunger. Just in Flint, we have a near 70% child poverty rate, 70. It's about 14% in the nation, and it's an unacceptable 70%. In Flint, we have no grocery stores, no full service grocery stores in Flint. So these are some of the reasons, not just in Flint, but in Cleveland and Philadelphia and Detroit and Chicago, and the list goes on, where there is, the greater, more disparities in lead exposure.
A couple more questions that were sort of leading off of that would be, what could be done for these older buildings and their plumbing? And, what is the actual physical solution? And then how long for the children that have been affected by lead, how long will this affect their life? Will we still be talking about, children facing lead poisoning and the effects of that for the rest of their lives?
Oh, that's a great question. So we know what to do to get rid of the lead. And I'm going to read you one of my favorite quotes from a scientist who was at a lead poisoning conference in 1969. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, the problems and cures are so well known that if we don't address this crime. We deserve like every, implication that comes from it. So even in 1969, like we knew it was bad and we knew what to do. Another one of my heroes I talk about in the book, Alice Hamilton, she was a lead expert in the 1920s, 100 years ago. So, we've known lead was bad for a long time, yet we have not strengthened regulations to limit its use or to get it out of the environment. After Flint, there's been some really positive ripple effects in regards to lead. Before Flint, the nation really thought that we took care of lead. Like, oh, that's a problem of yesterday. After Flint, like, oh my gosh, it's a problem of today and it's a problem of tomorrow when you respect that science. There was also a report that came out after Flint, which was about the economics of lead elimination. Like, what if we truly dug out the lead pipes and we abated houses, so got rid of the lead that's in the paint and the soil where kids hang out? That sounds really expensive. And a lot of people are like, oh, we can't do that. That's too hard. How do we fix every house? But if we do that, it actually makes tremendous economic sense. That report showed that we would save our nation $80 billion a year when you include the decreases in economic productivity, and healthcare costs and special education costs and criminal justice costs. So the cost of not doing anything is actually worse for taxpayers and worse for society. So there is a lot that we can do. For example, in Michigan, now we have something called the Lead Safe Home Program that's available to many communities. So any family that is on Medicaid, they can get their house inspected and fixed for free before a kid is exposed. And that's exactly what we need to be doing. It's this concept of primary prevention, finding lead in the environment before children are exposed. Unfortunately, what we are doing now, especially with how we screen children for lead at their checkups, that is unethical. It's using kids as detectors of environmental contamination. It's like using kids as canaries in a coal mine. Like, oh, look, we found lead in the kid's blood. Like, where is it in the environment? But it's too late for that kid. So, lead is a poison. It's a neurotoxin. It's irreversible. It's potent. It does have these lifelong potential manifestations. Not every kid is going to present the same way, and hopefully many kids will be fine. But it's going to take long-term surveillance, which is something we're trying to do with the Flint Registry, long-term support. We even know kids exposed to lead in early childhood as seniors can have things like early dementia and high blood pressure and kidney disease and gout. So there's a lot of long-term manifestations of lead exposure, which is why it's so important to focus on prevention, to support the public health programs, to strengthen regulations, and codes and different policies that creates more transparency, so people know that there's lead in the environment and that it's eliminated.
All right, I think this will be our last question for the afternoon. If an individual wants to get involved in helping to eradicate this problem, what would you suggest as a first step?
That is a great question. So there's lots of, there's lead advocacy groups, there's drinking water advocacy groups, there's environmental groups, there's public health groups. So don't reinvent the wheel. Find other folks who are already doing this work and get involved with them. There's so many people ask me after reading this book, like, oh, how can I help Flint? Or like, what can I do? And I don't want you to help Flint. Like, if you want to, that's fine. You can help Flint. But like, find something that you're really passionate about. Like, what do you super care about? What keeps you up at night? Is it immigration or the climate crisis or, racism? Like, what do you care about? Find your passion. And then, as in the book, find your peeps, find your team, find your village to do this work with you. And then it becomes more fun and a lot easier.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon with us, Dr. Mona. You are a true inspiration. And I hope once this COVID thing disappears that you'll join us on campus for a face-to-face conversation where we can think about more, how can we be that domino, right? How do we find what we're passionate about and really make a change? I think you've inspired quite a few Concordia students today. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys. Stay safe. Wear a
Thanks so
mask.
much.
Get your vaccine when you can.
Yes.
Yes.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet.
All right.
Thank you to all the students who attended as well. Thank you for your great questions.
And faculty, if if you didn't get to take attendance in the chat, we can work with IT to pull the names of all the students who were in attendance today.
And we apologize if you were sending something in the chat and we didn't see it. There was hundreds of students also putting their attendance in the chat, so we missed a lot of the chat.
All right. She was so inspiring.
Great. It was great. Thank you so much.